Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. My name is Joe Carr. Sports journalist Sean McAdam is our guest today. A 1981 PC graduate, Sean is best known for his many years of covering Major League Baseball and the Boston Red Sox. His first book, Boston, America's Best Sports Town, came out earlier this year. Sean joins us by phone before heading to Fenway Park to cover the Red Sox and Toronto Blue Jays, the first game of the last series before the All-Star break. Sean, let's start by talking about this Red Sox team. 3 consecutive sweeps, 65 wins before the middle of July, really rolling. What do you see here?
Yeah, it's obviously been a terrific year for them so far, Joe, and I think exceeded most fans' expectations. I think everyone thought and expected that the Red Sox would be contenders, as they have been for the last couple of years. But to see them on this sort of record-setting pace where they are on a pace to win better than 110 games, as you mentioned, as we tape this, they've won 9 in a row, 16 out of 19, and it's a good time to be a Red Sox fan right now. There isn't much to pick apart. It seems that every facet of the game is coming together for the Red Sox. They're among the leaders in many offensive categories. Their pitching has been, for the most part, very good. The bullpen, other than a hiccup here or two, which is bound to happen over the course of a long season, has been very dependable. A new manager, a rookie manager in Alex Cora, has enjoyed great success through the first 3.5 months. So, as I noted, if you're a Red Sox fan, life is good these days.
Of course, we always bring a healthy dose of fatalism and have to point out, of course, it's only the middle of July, so a lot can happen the rest of the way.
That's right.
I'd like to talk more about baseball in a few minutes, but let's discuss this book, Boston, America's Best Sports Town, and you make a compelling case for that title. What is it about Boston, its teams, and its fans?
Well, there's a number of aspects. And first of all, the title is meant to engage a little debate and a little back and forth, perhaps from other regions and cities. I think there are a number of cities in the country that could reasonably make that claim, but we're always a little parochial here in New England. And the project was pitched to me by a publishing house in Minnesota, and it sounded like a fun project, so I was happy to take it on and enjoyed putting the book together. But as I said, a pretty compelling case can be made that Boston is certainly among the best sports cities or towns in the country, and maybe even, depending on how you measure these things, the best. It certainly has great history and tradition. When you look at all 4 Boston franchises, they are each charter members of their respective leagues. The Red Sox, of course, date back to 1901 and the creation of the American League. The Patriots are charter members of the AFL, not the NFL, but the American Football League that came along in 1960. The Celtics, an original NBA franchise, and the same can be said of the Bruins and the NHL. So you have great history and tradition. You also have an extraordinary number of kind of transformational players that have played for all 4 of the franchises. In baseball, that dates back to Babe Ruth, quite obviously, and moves on to Ted Williams and Carl Yastrzemski and a host of other Hall of Famers who have played for the Red Sox, most of whom played in Fenway Park, which still stands as the oldest ballpark in the American League. And there's just great tradition and history associated with that facility. The Patriots had sort of an ignominious beginning for much of their first, 10, 15 years, but obviously since the turn of this century have become really the standard by which all NFL franchises are measured for success, and of course quarterbacked by Tom Brady in 5 Super Bowl appearances and counting. The Celtics dynasty of the 50s and 60s is well documented with Bill Russell and 9 straight titles and 11 in the span of 13 years, and then success that continues to this day to the point where the Celtics have won the most number of championships in the NBA. And the Bruins, though they don't have the rings to match the Celtics, certainly have had great success at times, particularly in the 40s and again in the late 60s and through the mid 70s, and boasts, again, iconic players from Eddie Shore to Bobby Orr to Ray Bork to present-day stars like Patrice Bergeron. So there's great stars, great athletes, great stories, great championships, and history and tradition associated with all four. And in the book, we go beyond the four, although they do take up the lion's share of the book. But there are other unique and particular aspects of Boston sports that we delve into, including the Boston Marathon, which is, of course, the most famous road race in the Western Hemisphere with its history. We touch on the Beanpot Tournament in Boston, which, of course, features the 4 Division I college hockey programs in Boston and nearby Cambridge, and has got a great history associated with it. There's the head of the Charles race. There's the great Boston College, that small C for our former Big East rivals. Harvard and BU and BC and Northeastern and all of the great student athletes that have gone there, and going back to Harvard football success a century ago, and really the creation of what we now know as college football. So there's so many stories to uncover, and I think if you add them all up, as I said, a pretty compelling case can be made that Boston is indeed America's best sports town.
Another factor you point to in the introduction is passion, and that certainly shows today, as you reference in the book, 2 sports radio stations that are 2 of the most popular stations overall in the Boston radio market. So much interest and so much attention. In fact, this relates to your current professional home, Boston Sports Journal, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But this is the only place I've ever lived, this area in New England. But I can't imagine that passion is matched or exceeded anywhere else.
Yeah, certainly not exceeded. There are other great sports towns, as we noted. I think New York and Philadelphia on the East Coast can make their claim, Chicago in the Midwest. But there is a great passion that comes with being a sports fan. And, as we talked a little bit the other day, Joe, when we met up for the first time in a while, that baseball is, got its detractors and has some things to overcome, but the Red Sox still sell out the vast majority of their games. They will attract, if not top 3 million, they'll come very close to that in terms of attendance at Fenway this year. You noted the 2 very popular and ratings killing 2 Boston sports radio stations. There are some markets in which there is a sports talk station, but this one has 2 that are frequently among the 2 most popular stations in the market. That certainly indicates the broad and deep interest in sports. It is not to stereotype. We kind of, in the Northeast, where sports are life and death sometimes, we make fun of the rather casual way that some fans in other cities treat their sports teams, and particularly Southern California becomes a target where people show up, in the second inning and then leave by the 6th. It's not like that here. It never has been. I don't think it ever will be. Sports are important. Hopefully people keep it in perspective in the big picture, but it's something that is very much part of the makeup of this region, and the dedication to the teams for which fans have around here is perhaps unmatched across the country.
The book, and once again, its title is Boston, America's Best Sports Town, has an interesting format, which provides a number of entry points. So it starts, as Sean indicated, with chapters about each of the 4 pro franchises. I noticed in alphabetical order: Bruins, Celtics, Patriots, Red Sox, and you've written a narrative about each team's history, the 5 greatest games for each, a list of the most important trades or draft picks in the case of the Patriots, each team's Mount Rushmore, and a summary of other great players who did not make that top four. So a lot of research and a lot of tough calls. What was the process like?
Yeah, it was a bit intimidating to begin with. I had not written a book before, and it's kind of like, staring up. You're at the foot of a very large mountain, realizing that you need to get to the top, and you just kind of start hiking away. And thankfully, as a native New Englander who, like you, has lived here all his life, I had a certain institutional knowledge of all four teams, some better than others. Obviously, having covered the Red Sox for the last 30 years, I know their current history very well, and my own fandom dates back to 1967. That was my entry point into Red Sox Nation, if you will. So, I think if you live here, you have an appreciation and almost by osmosis, understand the history, not only behind the Red Sox, but the other three as well. But certainly there was research to be done and things to look up and points to check. And, I was able to utilize, the PR department of all four teams for some help and going through some library and history texts and clippings and online and everything else. And, to put everything in perspective and to get some details correct and exact. So some of it was painstaking, but for the most part, it was a fun project. And as I said, I think I started out with something of a built-in advantage, having been a fan and or at one time anyway, and remain a fan of the other three teams that I don't follow professionally. But that made it a little easier because I started with a pretty good base.
Well, your humility does not surprise me, having known you for so long, Sean, but it goes so much beneath the surface in some ways. And I picked out one nugget that I thought was terrific by way of example of the kinds of surprises that are in this book. Among Boston's top Olympians, we found James Connolly from 1896 and 1900. I'm going to read this paragraph. Boston prides itself on its place in history, sports and otherwise, so it's entirely fitting that this son of Boston was the first modern Olympic champion. Connolly, a 27-year-old Harvard undergrad, left school to compete at the first modern Olympic Games in 1896 in Athens, Greece, where he won the triple jump, then known as the hop-skip jump, to become the first Olympic champion in more than 1,500 years. Connolly also finished second in the high jump and third in the long jump. 4 years later at the 1900 Olympics, Connolly finished second in the triple jump, and 4 years after that, he covered the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis as a journalist for the Boston Globe. So there you go. Who knew about that until you uncovered it for us? So
certainly I didn't, and that was, that's part of the fun. You think you're pretty well versed in the history of the region and the contributions to the sporting world, and then you uncover a nugget like that, and it's kind of fun to include and to tell that story and pass it along.
So Mr. Connolly's versatility reminds me of yours, sort of. You, in addition to being...
I've checked my closet. I find no Olympic medals in there, Joe. And my athletic prowess, I'm here to tell you, is nowhere near that level. But, I mean, there, as I said, that was part of the fun. Everybody knows about the Bobby Orrs and the Bill Russells and the Larry Birds and the Tom Brady's and Ted Williams and so forth. But, part of the fun was uncovering some lesser known stories like that one.
So in addition to those chapters on the pro sports team, as Sean indicated, there's a chapter on college sports, one on area Olympians, one on soccer, one called Only in Boston. That included the marathon, the regatta, Thanksgiving Day, high school football games, and so forth. And then a chapter on the ones that got away, which is interesting stuff. Describe that chapter to us, Sean. Tell us what that's all about.
Yeah, that's talking about some people who grew up in the Boston area and, got away in terms of fulfilling their athletic dreams elsewhere. Somebody like Patrick Ewing, who grew up in Cambridge, Mass, and went to Ringen Latin, and of course went on to star at Georgetown and a Hall of Fame career with the Knicks. So, just sort of, we are a little, as I mentioned earlier, parochial in our tastes and our fandom when it comes to sports. But it was a recognition that there are some people with Boston roots who ended up enjoying most of their athletic success elsewhere, and that was an effort to kind of shine a light. And of course, there are many with New England and Boston's roots in hockey, with so many high school and college programs in the area. There were a number of NHL players who were born in New England and born in the greater Boston area, including Jeremy Roenick and some others who some played collegiately local and some didn't, but all have some ties to the area. And that includes, obviously, a good chunk of that great 1980 Olympic team, the Eruzionis and Callahans and others who, as I said, some played locally, collegiately, and others didn't, but all had some New England roots tying them together.
Well, this book is a must-read for Boston sports fans. It's obviously available on Amazon. Where else can people get it, Sean?
Yeah, it's if you're hearing this in New England, it is largely a New England-based book in terms of its availability in brick-and-mortar stores. So if you're in the New England area, you can find it at Barnes & Noble. There are some great independent bookstores that carry it. But if you're out of New England, certainly Amazon is probably the easiest place to find it, no matter where you live.
Foreword by none other than Pedro Martinez, so how can you go wrong? Let's talk about your career, Sean. What did you study at PC, and how did your PC experience prepare you for a career in journalism?
Yeah, I was believe it or not, Joe, a political science major.
So was I.
When I applied, I had a very keen interest in politics and government, and still follow it. I don't know if you could call following politics a hobby, but it certainly, to this day, is still very much an interest of mine. And initially, I had designs on being sort of a political consultant, somebody to help run political campaigns. I came from a family who had very heightened political awareness and interest. And I can remember, at the dinner table, lots of discussions about current events and what was going on in the world and in the White House. And that stayed with me and does to this day. But I also, even from my teenage years, was very interested in writing and had interest in a number of areas, not only sports, but music. And when I was in high school, I won a contest that was called Be a Teenage Rock Critic. And if you've ever seen the movie Almost Famous, directed and written by Cameron Crowe, about his own life growing up in San Diego and as a 14 and 15-year-old, reviewing concerts and writing feature stories about bands and rock and roll. I sort of lived that out on a smaller scale here. I won that contest run by the Real Paper, which was an alternative sort of arts weekly in Cambridge. And for much of my high school career, got to attend all these great shows in Boston and write it, and was paid to write about them. So it was a great existence. And I continued to write during college and worked, as you well know, at the campus radio station, WDOM, alongside you at times. And when I got out, while I still was looking at particular job opportunities in politics, as you know, when you're getting out of school, it's kind of a intimidating thing. You look out and try to figure out what it is you're going to do with your life. And I had a job offer to work at a news talk station in Providence at the time, WEAN. and to become a producer for a sports, ironically, a sports call-in show hosted by a gentleman named Chuck Wilson, who was really my first mentor in the business. I worked there for 4 years, did some on-air work there, hosting, doing afternoon drive sports updates, filling in on the talk show when Chuck was off. And 4 years later, morphed into a job with the Providence Journal. And I was there from 1985 until 2008, most of that time covering the Red Sox. And I then worked a year at the Boston Herald. I then worked 7 or 8 years for Comcast Sportsnet New England, which is now known as NBC Sports Boston, a regional sports TV network in the Boston area. And for the last year or so, I have worked for kind of a startup website called bostonsportsjournal.com, again, covering the Red Sox. So along the way, I've done a lot of TV and radio work in Boston, contributed to both of those sports stations that we spoke of earlier, WEEI and 98.5 The Sports Hub, where I still do some occasional work. I occasionally contribute to WCVB Channel 5 on Sunday nights on their SportsCenter Overtime show. And I, along the way, have been a regular contributor to ESPN.com and for a short time, FoxSports.com. So I've really worked in virtually every platform in sports media, from newspapers to digital sites to radio and TV. And, it's been a great ride. One of these days I'll have to work for a living, but in the meantime, I've enjoyed my career, much of which, as you noted, has been following the Red Sox.
There's that versatility that I referenced a couple of minutes ago. Pioneer is a strong word, but it seems to me that you're an example of one of the people who were early on, a print journalist, perhaps fundamentally at one point, who did quite a lot of broadcast work, very common now. How do those complement each other when you're reporting stories, covering teams, involved in the day-to-day process of being a journalist, the craft of journalism, and you sort of have multiple ways to communicate what you've learned and what you know and other insights and perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about pioneers, you're probably talking about figures who tower over the New England sports media landscape. I think of both Will McDonough and Peter Gammons as having kicked that door in far before I started taking advantage of it. But in the 1980s, you would see Will McDonough, who was a great columnist for the Boston Globe for decades and pro football writer, show up on NFL pregame shows and deliver information. And Will was not by any stretch or any measure necessarily a polished TV performer. He was more of a street smarts reporter who grew up in Southie in South Boston, but had great sources and information that very few people had about the goings on and inner workings of the NFL. And I think it was NBC initially smartly recognized that, well, it doesn't matter that this guy doesn't look like your basic blow-dried anchor right out of TV school, but he has information and insight into what's going on in the game, and we want to pass that on to our viewers. And that, I think, sort of began the practice of hiring print or newspaper reporters for television for the purpose of providing that inside information. Now every network has their so-called insiders to break news or provide analysis. And so that door got opened by first Will McDonough and then Peter Gammons, who having worked at the Boston Globe and Sports Illustrated for much of his career, then went to ESPN and did both. And that was really the first sports media company that combined on air along with the written word. So Peter could write for ESPN's website and then appear in front of their cameras. And that kind of further opened the door. So in the late 90s, having covered the Red Sox for a number of years and gained something of a reputation and credibility, having attained some credibility, started doing a lot of radio work, first at WEEI on the famed Big Show, hosted by Glenn Ordway, which was just a powerhouse in terms of its popularity and ratings throughout the late 90s and into the early part of the 2000s. And that, while I was still at the Providence Journal, the exposure in Boston via EEI and the Big Show made me far more well-known in the Boston market for, and this was just as, the internet was offering the opportunity to read people who perhaps you couldn't buy a hard copy of their of a newspaper that they worked for, but you could begin to read what they wrote online via the internet. So the combination of that and the exposure from WEEI in the Boston market made me much more well-known among Boston media circles and Red Sox fans, and was a great boost to my career, and in turn helped, I'm sure, contributed to me being hired at the Boston Herald for a year, and then eventually for being hired at Comcast, where I worked for 7 or 8 years. So, and then along the way, I even before starting for Comcast, I did a lot of TV work on Channel 4 with both Bob Lobel and Dan Roach on Sports Final, and then Red Sox Weekly. It became what was once kind of an extra feather in your cap and a little additional freelance money to appear on radio and TV, soon became almost a necessity if you were going to be a print reporter in New England or anywhere for that matter. It certainly behooved you to be able to transfer your communication and reporting skills to the electronic media because of the exposure and name recognition. And also, I think, it helped, it gives you some credibility with the teams you cover, that you may be working for a so-called suburban paper or a paper out of the market, as the Providence Journal was, but they could also hear me on EEI and see me on Channel 4. And I think that helps solidify your credentials a little bit, even though you weren't working at the time for a paper in Boston.
This all takes us back to that idea of there being a lot of interest and passion around all of these teams. And that relates to your current project, it seems to me, in some ways. The Boston Sports Journal website that you referenced, about a year old, founded by you, Greg Bedard, and Christopher Price, so 3 highly regarded Boston journalists putting this together. It's a subscription-based online service covering the 5 Boston professional sports teams, including the New England Revolution, as I understand it, based on a model from Pittsburgh. And really, to some extent, it represents, it tells us something about the nature of journalism today and the way that it's delivered to people and the way people access it. What are your thoughts about how this all came about and how you hope it will evolve?
Yeah, it was, I don't want to take credit for being cited as a founder. It really was Greg Bedard's project. He had seen how well a similar site in Pittsburgh had operated, and a number of us were at the time out of work because of the vagaries and changing landscape of the sports media world. Greg had been at Sports Illustrated and had been laid off. I had been laid off at Comcast Sportsnet New England. Chris Price had been laid off at WEEI.com, and we were all looking for work and finding difficulty doing so because, of course, the newspaper business has been through a rough time as newspapers try to reinvent themselves and try finding somebody under the age of 40 who reads a newspaper every day. It doesn't happen. And you look at the circulation numbers for be it the Providence Journal or the Boston Herald or the Boston Globe, or even more national outlets like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, readership and circulation is a fraction of what it was even 20 years ago. And so everyone is trying to find a way to survive and thrive in what is a very changing media world and landscape. And, I referenced ESPN.com earlier, and while that remains the most visited and most popular digital sports site in the world, in part because of the brand popularity of ESPN, ESPN.com itself is not a moneymaker. In fact, it is a money loser that is carried by the broadcast properties that are the various broadcast properties and platforms that ESPN has. It's almost a loss leader. Well, that leads to the question, if ESPN.com can't make money, how in the world can any other sports news site do so without the brand name and exposure that ESPN already brings? So you're starting to see a number of both regional, in our case, and national websites that are using the subscription-based model. And Greg's idea was that the advertising on the site, which is not pop-up or at all kind of intrusive, but more banner ads, would take care of the travel expenses that it costs to cover teams on the road, which is quite expensive. And the subscriptions from the readers would essentially pay the salaries of the site's employees and reporters. So that was the business model going in. We are coming up, as this is taped, we are about 2 weeks shy of our 1-year anniversary. If you count some complimentary subscriptions that Greg has graciously given to all active and retired military personnel, we're up to about 10,000 subscribers and building every day. We've added to the staff, as you referenced, to coverage of the Revolution, New England's sort of fifth professional team. So I think people who have sampled it enjoy it, and I'd urge people to check it out at bostonsportsjournal.com.
Well, it's an excellent product. I've been a subscriber since day one because it's a matter that's so interesting to me, and it's really, really well done. One thing that strikes me is that, boy, you guys work hard. You cover the Red Sox. Brian Robb covers the Celtics, and that's a big assignment for anybody, but certainly the passion that you have for it, that you all have for it, shows through.
Well, thank you, Joe. I'm glad you're enjoying it, and I hope other people look into it and are as happy with it as you are.
There's a lot of hand-wringing these days, Sean, about the state of the game of baseball. You observe it very closely every single day. Do you have concerns about the game and its future?
Yeah, I think you have to, Joe. If you go back to the 1950s, I was born in November of 1959, so I can't speak to that with any memory or experience, but technically I am a child of the 50s. And if you go back to the 1950s, it was, the three most popular sports in this country were baseball, boxing, and horse racing. And we know what has become of the latter two. They have become decidedly niche sports which appeal to a very fervent but narrow base of fans. The horse racing fan is often quite older, or perhaps geographically near,